The ground trembles before you hear them. A deep rolling vibration that travels through your chest before your eyes can even make sense of. The shapes emerging from the dust. Massive silhouettes sway forward, towers of muscle and leather, their breath steaming in the morning air. If you were standing in that line of spears, you probably wouldn't survive, not because of skill alone, but because fear would reach you first. This is how Carthage announces itself to the Mediterranean world, with elephants. Carthage did not invent war elephants, but it perfected their psychological deployment during the Punic Wars, drawing inspiration from Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander the Great. By the late 3rd century BCE, Carthage fielded North African forest elephants smaller than Indian elephants, but faster and more agile, most famously during the First and Second Punic Wars. Their presence in early battles, like the clashes in Sicily against Rome, forced Roman commanders to confront an enemy they had never trained to face on the battlefield. Elephants functioned as a shock arm. They advanced ahead or alongside infantry, disrupting formations, trampling shields, and most critically breaking morale. Roman manipular formations depended on discipline and spacing. Elephants attacked that system psychologically before physical contact even occurred. Carthaginian commanders understood this and used elephants to unnerve inexperienced troops, while their infantry exploited the chaos. The strengths were obvious: intimidation, mass, and momentum. But weaknesses were equally real. Elephants were difficult to control, vulnerable to missile fire, and prone to panic if wounded. Soldiers supporting them needed specialized coordination, light infantry to screen them, cavalry to exploit gaps, and commanders who understood when not to deploy them. A lesser-known fact often overlooked is that many Carthaginian elephants never reached battle at all, dying from transport stress or climate exposure. Modern historians still debate their true effectiveness, with some arguing elephants mattered less than disciplined infantry and superior generalship. Compared to Roman legions or Macedonian phalanxes, elephants were unreliable, but no other army weaponized fear so immediately or so viscerally. The elephants you see on the battlefield are the final product of years of preparation, not wild beasts simply driven forward in rage. Carthage maintained supply networks in North Africa to capture, tame, and train forest elephants, binding animal and handler into a single battlefield unit. Each elephant was paired with a mahout, an elite specialist whose survival depended on absolute control under chaos. Training focused on conditioning elephants to noise, pain, and confusion. Drums, horns, and shouted commands were introduced early so the animals would not panic when battle erupted. They were taught to advance in straight lines, to push into dense formations, and to tolerate the press of friendly infantry around their legs. This integration mattered. Elephants did not fight alone. They functioned as moving terrain, reshaping the battlefield for Carthaginian foot soldiers and cavalry. A clear example comes from Carthaginian operations in Sicily during the First Punic War, where elephants were used to anchor infantry advances against Roman forces unfamiliar with such threats. Infantry had to be disciplined enough to advance behind elephants without breaking formation, while skirmishers protected the flanks from missile fire that could spook the animals. Cavalry waited for the moment when enemy lines buckled, exploiting the disorder elephants created. The strength of this system was synergy. Elephants amplified combined arms warfare, multiplying the effectiveness of otherwise conventional troops. But the weakness was training time and logistics. Losing an elephant meant losing years of investment, and not every mahout survived long enough to become proficient. A strange side detail preserved in ancient sources suggests some mahouts carried metal spikes or chisels, intended to kill their own elephant if it panicked, an act of grim mercy and battlefield necessity. Scholars still debate how often this occurred, compared to Roman legionaries, who could be trained quickly and replaced easily. Carthaginian elephant units were rare, expensive, and irreplaceable, powerful, but fragile. When Hannibal Barca leads his army into Italy into 18 BCE, the elephants become more than weapons, they become symbols of inevitability. Their most famous appearance comes during the Battle of the Trebia, an officially recorded engagement that demonstrates both their terror and their limits. As Roman infantry advanced through freezing river water, already exhausted and disordered, Hannibal released his elephants to strike the flanks. Functionally, the elephants served as mobile shock wedges. They drove into Roman cavalry and light infantry, scattering them and exposing the heavier maniples behind. Roman horses panicked at the unfamiliar scent and sound, giving Carthaginian cavalry dominance early in the fight. This allowed Hannibal's infantry Libyans, Iberians, and Gauls to fight Romans already shaken. Both physically and psychologically. The strength of elephant deployment here lay in timing. Hannibal did not rely on them alone. They were one part of a carefully layered ambush. Yet Trebia also revealed weaknesses. Cold weather weakened the animals, and by the time of Lake Trasimene, many elephants had already died from exposure and disease during the Alpine crossing. An often overlooked reality behind the legend. A lesser-known fact is that at Trasimene, elephants played little direct role, yet their earlier presence had already shaped Roman expectations. Fear lingered even when the beasts were gone. Soldiers trained to face human enemies now imagine something worse waiting in the fog. Academic debate continues over whether elephants actually killed large numbers of Romans or merely disrupted formations. Most evidence favors disruption over destruction. Compared to Roman manipular flexibility, elephants were blunt instruments, but against unprepared troops, blunt force was enough. The soldiers supporting these attacks needed restraint, not aggression, advancing to quickly risk colliding with their own elephants. Compared to later Roman tactics developed at Zama, early Roman armies lacked both experience and countermeasures. At Trebia, that ignorance was as deadly as any tusk. By the middle of the Second Punic War, the fear that once froze Roman ranks began to fade. Replaced by adaptation and hard-earned confidence, elephants had not changed. Roman soldiers had. The turning point in academic discussion often centers on battles like Zama in 100 BCE, where the same animals that once shattered formations became liabilities. When faced with prepared opposition on the battlefield, elephants were supposed to break order. At Zama, Roman commanders engineered the opposite effect. Manipular formations were deliberately opened into corridors, allowing elephants to charge through harmlessly, while skirmishers targeted them with javelins and noise. Functionally, the Roman army learned to let momentum exhaust itself. Elephants without surprise lost their greatest strength. The weakness of elephants was control. Once wounded or confused, they could turn back into friendly lines. Carthaginian infantry supporting them needed exceptional discipline to avoid collapse when this happened. In contrast, Roman legionaries trained to maintain cohesion under stress found it easier to adjust than to panic. A strange side detail preserved in Polybius describes Roman trumpeters deliberately blasting horns at close range, exploiting elephants' sensitivity to sound. The sensory overload tactic is rarely discussed outside specialist scholarship, yet it proved decisive. Elephants that panicked became obstacles rather than weapons. Scholars continue to debate whether elephants were ever truly effective against professional armies or only against inexperienced troops. Compared to Macedonian successors, who deployed elephants alongside rigid phalanxes, Carthage lacked uniform formations to stabilize failed charges. Roman flexibility proved superior. Soldiers facing elephants now required calm, spacing, and coordination, rather than raw courage. This shift marked the decline of elephants as shock troops. They remained frightening, but fear alone could no longer win wars against an enemy that learned, adapted, and remembered. Behind every charging elephant stood equipment, preparation, and a human specialist whose role was far more complex than ancient art suggests. Carthaginian war elephants were not armored juggernauts like later medieval fantasies, but they were not unprotected either. Some carried padded headpieces, leather flank coverings, and simple wooden towers or harnesses designed to stabilize riders or signal commands. The true weapon, however, was not metal, it was control. Mahouts required extraordinary skill. They had to guide an animal weighing several tons through noise, pain, and confusion while responding instantly to battlefield changes. Their training emphasized calm pressure from knees and feet, verbal cues, and hook tools used for directional control rather than punishment. A single mistake could send an elephant veering into friendly troops, undoing an entire formation. In Battle elephants worked best when paired with light infantry who understood spacing and restraint. These soldiers needed discipline equal to Roman legionaries, resisting the instinct to surge forward too quickly, compared to the rigid Macedonian phalanx, which struggled to adapt around elephants. Carthaginian forces relied on flexibility and advantage until things went wrong. A lesser-known detail found in North African archaeological sites suggests elephants were sometimes fed fermented mash before battle, possibly to dull fear or increase aggression. Historians argue fiercely over this point, as ancient sources exaggerate animal rage, but the possibility highlights how uncertain elephant control truly was. The strengths of elephant equipment lay in intimidation and reach. Their weaknesses lay in vulnerability. Javelins, sling stones, and fire could wound eyes or feet, triggering panic. Unlike Roman shields or Iberian swords, elephants could not be retrained quickly or replaced. Academic debate often compares Carthaginian elephants to those used by Seleucid armies at Ipsus, where massed elephants stalled cavalry rather than infantry. Carthage lacked the numbers for such tactics. Their elephants were tactical tools, not strategic solutions. The soldiers who fought alongside them needed patience, coordination, and restraint, qualities harder to train than aggression. Elephants magnified skill, but they punished error mercilessly. By the war's final years, elephants no longer dominated the battlefield, they haunted it. Their decline was not sudden, but gradual, shaped by Roman adaptation and Carthaginian desperation. After Zama, elephants remained in use across the Mediterranean, but never again as decisive shock forces against disciplined armies. What survived was memory more than method. Functionally, elephants had always been situational weapons. They required surprise, space, and an enemy unprepared for chaos. Once those conditions disappeared, so did their effectiveness. Roman legions, now trained to open lanes, target vulnerable points, and resist panic, neutralized the very strengths elephants depended on. Compared to earlier Roman armies, these soldiers fought elephants as problems to solve, not monsters to flee. Carthage's final deployments show this shift clearly. Elephants were often placed defensively, guarding flanks or camps rather than leading assaults. Their role became deterrence rather than disruption. The weaknesses, cost, control, and vulnerability now outweighed the benefits. A strange and often overlooked side fact is that Roman triumphs later displayed captured elephants in parades, stripped of their terror and turned into symbols of conquest. Fear had been converted into spectacle. This cultural reversal matters. It shows how psychological weapons lose power once understood. Academic debate continues over whether elephants accelerated tactical innovation or merely delayed inevitable outcomes. Some historians argue Roman flexibility would have emerged regardless. Others suggest elephants forced Rome to mature faster as a military system, compared to Gallic warbands or Hellenistic armies that relied on shock and mass. Rome built endurance and adaptability. The soldiers once terrified by elephants now trained specifically to counter them, developing spacing discipline, nerve control, and coordinated response skills transferable to every battlefield challenge that followed. In the end, elephants did not fail because they were weak. They failed because war evolved. What remained was legend, towering beasts in the snow, charging through history, unforgettable but no longer decisive. Carthage's war elephants were never just animals on a battlefield. They were experiments in fear, momentum, and psychological dominance. At their peak, they worked not because they killed in vast numbers, but because they shattered certainty. Roman soldiers at Trebia did not break because elephants were unstoppable. They broke because they had no answer yet. In warfare, that gap between expectation and reality is often where defeat begins. From a functional perspective, elephants were situational force multipliers. When combined with cavalry, infantry discipline, and intelligent command, they created temporary battlefield superiority. Hannibal understood this better than most commanders in history. He used elephants as part of a layered system, not as independent weapons. Their effectiveness depended entirely on context, terrain, weather, enemy experience, and timing. Their weaknesses, however, were structural. Elephants required immense logistical investment, specialized handlers, and favorable conditions. They could not adapt mid-battle the way human formations could. Once Roman armies learned to absorb their charge rather than resist it, elephants lost their strategic value. At Zama, adaptation defeated terror. Compared to other ancient military systems, the Macedonian phalanx, Roman manipular legions, or Parthian horse archers wore elephants were the least sustainable. They did not scale well, they could not be replaced quickly, and they punished mistakes more harshly than any other arm. Yet no other weapon forced such rapid innovation from its enemies. In academic debate, elephants are often framed as overhyped. That judgment misses the point. Their true impact was not longevity, but acceleration. They forced Rome to become something new, faster. In that sense, elephants succeeded beyond their battlefield record. As weapons, they faded. As catalysts, they endured. And as images looming shapes in dust and snow, they remain among the most powerful reminders that warfare is as much about the mind as the blade.